Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for Tuesday, August 26th, 2025. My name is Matthew Watkins, editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune. And, a hunch tells me, Eleanor, that this could possibly be our last TribCast recorded of 2025 that is during a legislative session.
I cannot believe you would say that and curse us like this. I just want you to know that, come Christmas, when we're still doing this, I will pull back this quote and throw this in your face.
Okay.
Let's say I hope greatly that this is the last TribCast we are doing during a special session.
This, of course, is because lawmakers have passed the maps, the redistricting maps, the topic of the TribCast for the past 2, maybe 3 weeks.
1,000 weeks.
In the middle of the night, Saturday morning, Friday night, staving off a Democratic filibuster, which, we can talk about the rules, we can talk about all that, but I think those of us who were expecting to have to work through the weekend were greatly relieved about.
Some of us who were so this is funny actually. I was supposed to be on the 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. filibuster shift, and I went to bed. My whole plan, right, was go to bed at 9 p.m. on Friday night because I have to be up at 5 a.m. So at midnight, I go to bed. I went to bed. I'm not joking. What must have been 3 minutes before they said you cannot filibuster. Still woke up at 4:45 a.m. Saw that they had decided not to filibuster. Went back to sleep, and then woke up at 9 a.m. Oh God, I hope that wasn't a dream. And I didn't go back to sleep. And everyone's like, where is Eleanor? Anyway, so the timing was terrible, but my sleep debt appreciated it.
Well, I'm glad you were able to go back to sleep. I have reached the age of my life where if I wake up, it's over for me.
Yeah.
So
4:45 is pretty I can get back. I can get back to sleep. Yeah, I can make it happen. Yeah.
Okay, very good. That voice, of course, Eleanor Klivanoff, law and politics reporter for the Texas Tribune. I will eventually get that correct
A position
on the podcast.
you created as editor-in-chief. Yeah.
Yes. I love that you think I actually have that much power, and it's not.
And
just...
to be fair, I did cook up the name myself.
Yeah.
But
very good. We are joined this week by climate reporter. I got that one easily. Emily Foxhall joining us from what is not a Harry Potter closet in Houston. Hello, Emily.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So yeah, like I said, I'm going to finish my thought here. The maps have passed. They are on their way to Governor Abbott's desk. Now we have a Texas legislature that is very tired, that is very sick of being in Austin.
Very angry with each other.
And I think, we got a 3-day weekend coming up. I think they're going to want to try to get this done and move on and finish their work for the year. So,
that is what Dustin Burrows said. We're going to get this thing done by Labor Day.
Yeah, exactly. And so
the other big priority left to do is
flooding, which is why Emily is here. Emily has been watching very long and emotional committee hearings over this measure, over response to the floods. She has been writing about the various legislative responses to those floods, and that is what we are going to talk about today. Emily, I want to start by just, I think, committee hearings are often dry affairs. You get a few bills a year that have the kind of emotional kind of testimony that happens. This one was a particular one. We saw families, particularly from Camp Mystic, coming and talking to lawmakers. Lawmakers being, I think, pretty blunt and frank, and sometimes even kind of apologizing for their own kind of mistakes and past things that happened. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about what you've seen, particularly from those hearings in recent days and weeks, as lawmakers come together and try to, prevent something like this from happening again?
They have been definitely very emotional. It's interesting just thinking back. I feel like so much has happened. It's almost been 2 months since the flood, so it's really felt like a whirlwind of these hearings. But if we go back to the start, there were special committees appointed in both the House and the Senate to look at flooding issues and disaster issues. And the first sort of like marathon hearing they held together was really focused on the disaster response. So Nim Kidd was kind of like the star of the show that day, going
He's
through.
the head of emergency management for the state. Yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead. Sorry.
thank you.
Mm.
He just sort of went through like a litany of issues. It was like almost overwhelming how many things had gone wrong. So just to give you a few examples, he went over how emergency management coordinators who can help county judges or mayors in emergencies, they don't have any licensing requirements in the state. He also went through a bunch of problems that happened with, so many people died in this disaster that the justices of the peace and the medical examiners who came in to help, it sounded like they had some issues keeping, first deciding when autopsies were really needed, and then second, just like managing so many bodies, like multiple family members from within the same family died and the bodies got sent to different places, which made it harder on the families trying to recover. So anyway, all to say, that first hearing was sort of like you could see lawmakers getting frustrated with these sort of repeat problems. Um, and that yeah, so that kind of culminated in later that day, some discussion too of the local river authority not pursuing grant funding, and there was sort of an outburst by lawmakers at that moment too, at the end of what had already been a really long day with a lot of issues, over frustration with, they had an opportunity in the lawmakers' view to put these sirens up and didn't move ahead with it. So we went from that all the way to more recently when the Camp Mystic family spoke. And as you mentioned, it was just hugely emotional, with people walking through, the grief of losing children, kind of being haunted by these nightmares of imagining what those last minutes were like for these little girls, um, as the floodwaters rose while they were in their cabins. And I also was just struck in that hearing by, not only the grief, but also like the strength. These parents were really pushing for change and not asking anyone, to like feel sorry for them, but asking for these bills to make camp safer. So it was both very sad, but also a very like admirable effort. They were really focused on making change in that one. And you could see lawmakers, again, kind of these frustration with errors that have sort of long been known as problems in the state, but also many of them were moved, lawmakers were moved to tears. So it was certainly a heavy feeling watching those.
Yeah, I want to go back to the first part. I think we should talk about the Camp Mystic families and everything there. But going back to your first kind of statement, I mean, something that has stood out to me from the beginning here was the sort of lack of professional expectations for these particularly like more rural small town officials, whether it's the emergency management coordinators, or people going out for jogs in the middle of the night when like flooding has already started and everything like that. um in some ways, maybe it almost felt like you know, under resourced local governments not fully comprehending the scope of their responsibilities or what needed to be done in order to keep their constituents or people visiting their communities safe. Um, I'm curious, you heard all that, you heard that frustration from Nim Kidd, who, of course, is a professional and who has dealt with, you know, if not dozens, then at probably at least a dozen like major catastrophes in the state for a long time. But he can't be deploying everywhere across the state every moment everything comes up. They're usually coming in after the terrible thing has already happened. I mean, did you sense any kind of um effort or intention by lawmakers to kind of change that in terms of giving those local entities the infrastructure needed, training needed, or whatever else it is to to make them be more prepared for future events like this?
That's definitely a big piece of the problem. I spoke to one expert early on who said the state emergency department really has like relatively a good reputation in the country. And as you said, they are professional, they're somewhat well funded. And so this woman was telling me often these local governments can get kind of lost, that people don't realize just how much the local governments are struggling in disasters because the state comes in so quickly. But in this case, the disaster really happened over a matter of hours. They call it flash flooding for a reason. And so you see the gaps in the local response very clearly in this case. Um, the one hearing we didn't talk about was the one that was in Kerr County that was, sort of like a mounting sense of anger with the way the local authorities, essentially just weren't awake. The county judge, who's supposed to be responsible for emergency scenarios, was asleep at another home, at a lake home that they have, and the county emergency management coordinator was sick and also asleep as these floodwaters were rising. So that's clearly been established as part of the issue here. But the changes the lawmakers have made was to put in, now they're going to have licensing requirements under these proposed bills for emergency management coordinators. So that will come with some training. And they're trying to put in place kind of like a chain of command where if the county judge isn't awake or the emergency manager isn't awake, here's who the responsibility will fall to. I remember hearing, though, it's like, if you're going to train the emergency management coordinator, like there seem to be some questions about who in the chain of command is actually going to get the training, right? Like if you go down the chain and that person doesn't understand what's going on, that feels like a gap I've been interested in. But
Like I
as
assume
well,
like
yeah.
most of these people, like, you go decades, maybe your entire career as like a county judge, and you never have a disaster like this, right? So like I understand sort of on a human level how easy it is to get kind of complacent and to
Yeah.
think like, yeah, I'm the guy that like if there's a disaster they will call, but like that doesn't mean I can never go to my friend's lake house. And then this happens and you think like, oh shit,
Yeah.
basically. And so like it's interesting to me that they like didn't have a chain of command of like, I bet there were a lot of counties out there that weren't affected by flooding that now are like, whose job was, like, if this was us, whose job is this? And like it's interesting they're going to put that in place now.
And there's so many compounding issues with this, right? I mean, uh, there's these questions of like, do people understand the difference between a flood watch and a flood warning?
No,
Right.
There's this,
they don't.
yeah.
Thank you. We've talked about that on this one here with, like right after. It's like, I think it's one of those things like, the weather people vastly overestimate how much people can keep that straight in their brains. Yeah.
Yeah, and then these problems of just warning fatigue, like maybe some of these officials or some people who were visiting saw the watch, but they didn't, take action or necessarily prepare for it, because so many times we get these watches and nothing happens.
How much is this response, particularly around emergency response? You've written about a few different bills, Senate Bill 2, which I think pertains more to the justices of peace and how to handle the bodies that you already mentioned, a training program for them. House Bill 3, creating a Texas Interoperability Council to kind of help develop strategic plans and communication and everything like that. Some other bills related to that as well. How much of this response, particularly around emergency preparedness for local governments, is addressing what Eleanor just talked about, where it's like, sure, in Kerr County, there's a flood and you could be worried about that, but, in the Panhandle or on the Gulf Coast, or, it could be something that we're not already talking about
Right.
anymore. Like, do you think that the actions that are being taken by this legislature in response to this are going to help the next thing that comes along that we're not
Even if it's
talking about
not
right
a
now?
flood. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the legislation looks really reactive to me. The bills that you mentioned, SB2 with the trainings and the dealing with the bodies, a lot of that just came straight out of the hearing from what NIMKID told lawmakers was the problem. The other big piece of legislation we haven't mentioned yet was SB3, which is the bill that's going to require sirens in certain parts of the hill country. And that's very focused on this area where the disaster occurred. It's focused on Flash Flood Alley specifically, and we'll set aside, if it passes, some money to fund these required siren and early notification systems. So yeah, I think this point you raise is something I've been thinking a lot about the last 2 months, because you all know I live in Houston. I've covered so many hurricanes. Sometimes as a reporter, I feel like I'm just going from one disaster to the next. And you see kind of this cycle, right? It's like this grief and mourning and shock at what happened. There's this immediate reaction to trying to fix the very specific problem. And then there's this recovery, which we try to pay attention to, but often we are just moving on to the next thing. So I think I'm certainly hoping to do some more reporting looking at how there are opportunities the state has had to be more forward-looking. And a big part of this legislation so far that I've seen is pretty reactive to this specific issue. But there's certainly things that I think they expect to help make emergency response better. There's some measures in the camp safety bills that the Mystic parents have pushed that will make camps, trying to get cabins out of the floodplain will help keep people out of harm's way in the future. And there is some money that's being set aside to improve weather forecasting, so a lot of environmental groups have really supported that one as a pretty forward-looking bill. But of course, you're right. Every disaster is different. Every part of the state faces different disasters. And, kind of like these big discussions, for example, on what floodplain development should look like. Those really haven't happened that I've heard in these meetings so far.
Because it is interesting that like the bill that I think got a lot of spotlight that didn't pass during the regular session was being carried by Ken King, in part because as a response to the Panhandle wildfires. And it's like, there's obviously a lot of discussion about whether or not that, well, actually, I think it's clear that that would not have been in place in time to help with this. But it's like you said, we're just moving from like one disaster to the next of like wildfire response. Like the windows between them are becoming narrower and narrower.
You mentioned the camp safety bill. Let's talk a little bit about that in that committee hearing. I want to talk a little bit about the parents first. You mentioned there was a lot of bravery and, of course, a ton of sadness. One of the things that has stuck with me is the picture that ran at the top of one of your stories, right, where you see these families in the gallery and just the pain on their faces. It like there's been very few things since those floods that have really hit me as hard as that. Just how sad and how much human suffering there is, and how brave it is to be going out
God, yeah.
and speaking about this. When the pain is so raw. Tell us a little bit about just what you were hearing from what lawmakers were hearing from parents in these hearings about, how they're feeling and what they want to see coming out of this.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting one because it wasn't a part of the first special session. These bills kind of came in more recent weeks as the parents got organized and, really pushed to get this as part of the agenda. They saw there was like really a gap in kind of comprehensive legislation looking at the camps where several dozen kids died at Camp Mystic, so I don't know. What struck me the most from the hearing with the parents was the details, like this dad talking about the countless hands of Go Fish and Uno he played with his kid, the many pages of books they read before he put her to sleep every night. And kind of like this mourning of the futures that their kids weren't going to get. Now we're in fall almost, and it's back to school time. And so parents were remembering, for one, it was thinking that their daughter was going to be there to hold the hand of the other kid as they went to school, or the daughter who poured the bowl of Cheerios for the younger child so they could get extra sleep. The daughter who was supposed to be going to college, moving into college right now. So a lot of it was just kind of this raw emotion of you send your kid to camp, what for many is like a generational experience. and they think they're going to be having fun riding horses and shooting archery. And then, one woman said, I never could I have dreamed that my kid was going to come home in a coffin. So it was sort of this grappling with guilt. Like they felt like they should have protected their kids in some cases, and they felt as parents that they let them down. A grappling with grief and loss of the past and of the future. And then, a very forceful call basically to say, make this right. Don't let any parent be gripped by the trauma that we are feeling right now.
And would you say the main focus of what they were asking for, the main focus of sort of where they were directing their, for a lack of a better term, blame for what happened, was the location of the cabins in the floodplain? Is that what their main focus was in terms of trying to enact change by showing up at these hearings?
Right. Getting cabins out of the floodplain is a big piece. Also, the fact that, as they told the story, the emergency plan for the kids was to stay in the cabin. And several of them expressed the sentiment that they raised their kids to follow rules and to follow orders. And in this case, doing so got them killed. So these bills, House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 1, both have components of um, requiring the camps to have these emergency plans for what to do in the case of flooding. When do you evacuate and when do you shelter in place? Because different disasters have different requirements with them. And the Senate bill goes even further to say, if there is a flash flood warning and kids are in the floodplain, you need to move them out. No more is this going to be a subjective question about whether and what to do in the case of a warning, but it will be required under that bill.
Yeah, I mean, it's so like our the Texas Tribune did a story looking at how like there was a similar disaster right in the 80s, and people died, children died because they were evacuating. Like it seems like these camps, they're built on the water, they're built to like engage with the river and with the water, but are it's like a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation in terms of knowing how to, and like putting so much of this on like teenagers to know how to respond to get younger kids out is just um like one of those things, again, like reactive, but you look back and you think like who could have ever let this happen, who could have ever let this get to this point.
Right, and that's where I think the failure of imagination kind of comes in,
Right.
right? Of what could happen and what do we react, how do we react when it does happen? I mean, I'm sort of reading directly from your story here, but House Bill 1, which is the bill that particularly pertains to camps, would require operators to develop emergency plans, including for disasters. They would have to be submitted by the state. They would include information on when to shelter or evacuate, and campers need to know, like, be taught how to react to that. And then another one I think is important, we talked a little about this in the immediate aftermath of just like putting evacuation routes on the doors of the cabins, right? Of this is where you go to get to higher ground, right? If you're evacuating through a low-lying area, that's going to be dangerous. But if you can identify ahead of time where you're going to be most safe from floodwaters, even for a short period of time, that can make a big difference.
And sorry, would any of these bills, and forgive me if you said this, make it like are we saying like you just can't put cabins in floodplains anymore? I mean, is are we going that far?
Right, the state won't license a camp if they have a cabin
Any
in the
cabin?
floodplain,
Okay, yeah.
but the big caveat here is, it's not going to apply to camps that are on lakes, so that would be, a camp like Camp Longhorn, I think. They're trying to make this very specifically for camps that are along rivers, which is something I'm trying to understand more.
Right. So it's sort of again very reactive. I mean, I'm also curious how this like I was out in Kerrville right after the floods, and like obviously like so much attention correctly on these camps and just like the horrors of what happened there. But we also saw like RV parks get washed away. We saw these like a lot of other development in low-lying areas that also, are like sometimes vacationers, but sometimes a lot of people I talked to were like vulnerable people who had an RV and nowhere else to live or things like that. Does any of this like address that?
Not that I have
Yeah.
seen. I mean, insofar as the emergency response would address how you
Hmm.
respond to emergencies anywhere, but there anytime floodplain regulation has come up in the hearings, there was a moment, I think it was Senator Menendez who had said, wouldn't it be better if the kids, well, let me back this up. So before the camp bill came up, the plan was to require camps to evacuate kids from cabins if they were in the floodplain, and if that failed, require the cabins to have a ladder so the kids could climb on the roof of the cabin if for some reason the water started coming and they hadn't evacuated. And I think it was Senator Menendez who said, wouldn't it be better for the cabins not to be there in the first place? And Senator Perry said, something to the effect of like, we're not going to go down the road of floodplain regulation, that has been discussed in the past, that if we take that up, all of Houston needs to be redesigned. So kind of like that's just political resistance has poked up time and again about looking holistically at floodplains. And I'm curious to see if that's going to change at all in the next, 6 months to a year as they continue to look at this. But it's definitely sort of the big piece to me is these decisions about where we build and how we build. But it's been explained to me, it's like Texas is a property rights state. There's a huge respect for letting people make choices about how they use their property. So that seems to be sort of politically what's at play here.
It it Right. I mean, I think that's right. It bears just sort of emphasizing though that what happened at Camp Mystic was horrible, and should steps should be taken to prevent it. But even if you take Camp Mystic out of the equation, another 111 people died in these floods, and they were not at camps. They were at, like you said, RVs. They were in cabins. Many of them from out of town, presumably had no idea where the floodplain was or anything like that. I mean, it feels to me like if it were ever going to happen, if the state were ever going to take steps to make more rules about what goes on in the floodplain or what can be built in the floodplain, it would be right now after over 130 people died. And if we're not doing it now, like how what is the political path to that happening in 2027? I just don't see it.
No, I mean, it's like it's different, right? But it's like after Uvalde, where it's like if you're not going to do gun
Right.
restrictions now, you're not going to do it. If you're not going to do floodplain restrictions now, you know, maybe that's just the way it is in Texas.
But I mean, what about just, I mean, you could require evacuation routes and evacuation processes for Airbnbs or hotels or RV
You could,
areas. I mean, is there any of that in the legislation, Emily?
I'm really curious what's going to happen with the siren legislation, because that I think is where I've had a lot of conversations around this education component. Experts who study warning systems say you can't just put a siren up and expect that when it blares, people are going to know what that means or what to do. Like if you're from a tornado prone place, you might stay put, which is exactly what you shouldn't do if there's a flash flood. So the legislation is really kind of leaves a lot of the details to rulemaking. It's the Texas Water Development Board that's going to put in place the real specific rules about what these warning systems look like. But I've talked to people who have said, it could be that you check in at a hotel or you check in at your campsite and they pass you a piece of paper that says, here's the risk you are facing. And when the siren goes off, here's what to do and where to go. And so that's kind of where I will be looking to see what the education components look like there. Because you're right. I mean, some of this is people who live or have second homes on the river, but a lot of it is tourism, especially because this disaster happened on July 4th. There were a lot of people there who just may not have known, what Flash Flood Alley is, what that river, that normally looks pretty peaceful, like the rage that it can kind of bear down on these locations is something that could be communicated when you check in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've said this on this podcast before, but my wife's has family up on the Oregon coast, and there is a constant threat of tsunami there, including what they call like the big one that is, they know going to wipe out a ton of property and things like that. And if when you check into the Airbnb or wherever, there is something on the door, and there is something telling you where to go, and there's supply kits, that are already stationed in high ground, and there's signs everywhere that's like tsunami evacuation route, follow these things. It doesn't feel like it would be that onerous or expensive to require those kinds of disclosures and things along those lines.
Yeah, but we have so many disasters here. I mean, what are you going to do? Like a wildfire warning and a hurricane warning and like it. We've got a lot of crises to manage. Like, yeah, it's a higher bar here than one tsunami.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Emily, what are you just watching as this plays out in the coming days? Like, what do you think is still sort of at stake or up in the air, or are you curious to see how it plays out?
Definitely curious. I mean, a lot of these bills have made it through both chambers, and now they're kind of at this like agreeing on the little changes that are being made back and forth. So we're kind of just following to see if some argument appears that, we didn't know about or didn't expect. But um yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it lands. And then I my understanding is these committees, I think at least one of them, they've said they will keep going after this. So what those hearings take up, with a little more breathing room, I think will be important, as you said.
I mean, if these bills pass sort of in their like the form they kind of are now and go into effect, do you feel like big picture we will be more protected from this happening again and being as horrific as we were before July 4th?
I'm like, are you asking me an opinion, Eleanor?
I'm asking you what
You know I
all the
can't have
experts
those.
you've talked to have told you.
Um, I I think on many of these bills, experts who follow these issues have said these are good first steps, right? Nobody's going to say that the steps the legislature is taking are not going to help in some incremental way. So yes, I think people are seeing some positive change come out of this. Again, there is an interest in these big picture issues and big picture conversations that um as I said, in disaster after disaster, it's really, really difficult to get people to take a step back and like look holistically at the problems. So, yes, I think this should, again, like kind of pending. There's a lot of rulemaking that has to happen along this stuff. So the devil is in the details, maybe to how successful this will be. But they definitely took steps to address some problems. I just think I guess I should say this is the climate reporter. The thing that people really have barely touched on is climate change and how these disasters are, you know, rain is more likely to be heavier, wildfire seasons are now longer. So what the state is facing today is not the same as what the state faced in the past. So that maybe even puts more pressure on these big picture questions. But did the state fix everything? I don't think anyone thinks that is the case. Did they fix some things? Yes, some people do feel like, sirens will help in a region without cell service that's rural. And these emergency problems seem to have been longstanding and they're taking steps. So um, I think that's where I would leave that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what the state is engaging in right now through its political process is a question, whether they want to frame it this way or not, of how much risk are we going to be comfortable with, right? You can't eliminate all risk. You can't eliminate all risk. And, if we didn't want to risk any kind of like terrible accidents, we wouldn't have streets and we wouldn't have cars and we wouldn't have all those different types of things, right? But like, what step are we willing to take to intervene in the like free market and the choices of individuals in order to prevent them from something like this happening? And how far can you even go in a world where the climate is getting warmer, where extreme weather is a reality, to prevent these things from happening? And, I think we're not going to change the political nature of this state, where people like often want to err on the side of freedom and low regulation and allowing sort of the private sector to you know uh, fill the needs and desires of the people of the state.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly put. How much risk are we willing to accept? And another piece of this is always how much are we willing to pay to lower that risk?
Right.
Um,
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Emily, for talking this through. Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you to our producers, Rob and Chris. We will be back next week.